Hi, class. um, Hope you're bearing up well under our new norm. Looks like we're going to be quarantined, distancing physically for at least another month now. So it's, I would say, determined that we'll not meet again as a class. So I will begin to explore how I'm going to do your final exam. I might have to shift gears a little bit and how I plan to do that. It'll still be a vocabulary exam. You'll still know most of it before you go in. I'm just not sure how that will happen. Speaking of exams and quizzes, on our Canvas page for this class, you will find a quiz with, I think it's two questions that I'm asking you to answer, one based on the supplemental videos that I posted last week, and the other is based on the supplemental readings that I posted. I'm not looking for long answers, I'm looking for relatively short answers. So take some time and complete those. That is how I know that you are doing the reading that is necessary for class and doing the other work that's necessary for class in addition to viewing the video. So please keep up. After this video, I will not post, I don't think I will post, no, I posted all the videos last week and all the readings that I'm going to post. I had to think for just a moment, but all the videos and readings, supplemental readings have been posted. So there'll be no more of those. But I will, after you've had a week to view this lecture and to complete all of that work, I will post another quiz. So each week you're going to have a quiz to make sure that you're keeping up on the work. It will largely not be a quiz based on the lecture. It will probably almost always be a quiz that's based on the supplemental material or the readings in your textbook, in your reader. So with that in mind, I also am going to, I got to figure out how to do this on Canvas, but I'm going to put up a sign up sheet for you to sign up and let me know when you would like to meet with me in this virtual format so that you can give me your presentation. So I need to look at my calendar, and I know that some of you are working. You're probably working more hours as of right now. If you know, especially if you're in some service industries, some of you might have all the time in the world. So I'll try to keep that in mind. If there are certain restrictions that I need to be aware of for you, it would be helpful if you email me that to let me know ahead of time. So look for that information to be coming. I certainly do hope you're keeping up with everything in class that's expected of you. Also, the college has decided to make classes, I think, a pass-fail. I need to find out exactly how that works, but you're able to elect to have a pass-fail for this class rather than having a letter grade. Now, I don't know how that will affect your GPA. I just haven't looked into that enough to be able to advise you on that as of right now. But if you feel like this format that we've had to shift to, this virtual classroom that we've had to shift to, if you feel like it's not really working for you as well, then you might want to consider the pass-fail option. If, however, you're doing okay with your written work, which is primarily how I'm grading you, the class participation will be whether or not you do the quizzes and the discussion questions that I post. But if you're doing fairly well in your written work, I don't even know if I'm supposed to say this, but I would encourage you to stick with a letter grade, just so that it doesn't affect your GPA. Again, I don't know how those affect your GPA. Maybe they're not figured in, but it's something to look into and consider before you make that decision. I do believe that you're not able to change that if you change from a letter grade to the pass-fail. I don't think you're able to change back. So just something to keep in mind. The other thing that I wanted to point out to you, I don't know how much you're following the news about the current COVID-19 coronavirus pandemic that we're in. I've been very much interested in some of the news that we've seen coming out about this because it hit exactly upon some of the issues that we were talking about in the first couple of weeks of the semester, issues of life and death. In particular, you might remember the clip that I had you listen to about triage. You remember that from New Orleans and how there were, they had to make some decisions. I believe I sent that clip to you so that you could listen to the whole thing. It was a radio, it's from a PBS station, or PBS, called Radiolab. It's a program on PBS called Radiolab. And if you search for it online, you can look up Radiolab Triage. And if I think I did send that whole thing to everyone so you can listen to it, but you can search for it, Radiolab, and the topic is triage, and you can hear the whole thing. The reason I think that's incredibly, on target for what we were talking about is because there are hospitals right now that are developing protocols and how to handle these exact same situations, these life and death situations. What if, in some situations, they have developed protocol to tell doctors, this is how you determine who gets a ventilator and who does not get a ventilator. If they present in the ER, if they're admitted to the hospital and they're having trouble with breathing, and they're laying out criteria for doctors to follow. In another situation that I just heard about, either yesterday afternoon or this morning, listening to a news broadcast, there's one hospital that is saying they're giving the sole discretion to the doctor in the emergency room to make that decision. And in that case, some of the doctors are saying, wait a minute, that makes me too much like God, deciding who's going to live and who's going to die. And so some doctors are actually uncomfortable with that decision to be able to decide who gets a ventilator and who doesn't, who lives and who will die. But it is, I find it comforting in some strange way that we covered that material, and so you understand. The topics we deal with in current moral and social issues really are everyday topics that we deal with in life. None of us, I think, could have foreseen, however, that we would be in the midst of a 100-year pandemic and while we're studying this stuff. Okay, well, last week we began to dive into the issues of sex, sexual ethical issues. And so I want to go a little bit further with that. I shared with you how St. Augustine had a huge effect on our understanding of sex and some of the norms that in the Western world we adopted. So I thought I would go a little bit, further with that today. And in fact, when I left you, I was explaining that there are that when we talk about marriage, there actually is two parts to marriage. And so I thought I would explain that to you, but then also go into a little bit of history. Marriage, in some form, has existed for hundreds, if not even thousands of years. Um, Clearly, we don't know how earliest humans came to understand the concept of marriage as we understood it. We do know that as far back as in ancient Greece and in other ancient civilizations, they did have the concept of marriage, but it was it was primarily I guess you would understand it as a civil union. In fact, through much of history, women did not have a choice in who they married. Even though it's supposed to have ended, there are still cultures that do prize that sort of arrangement, an arranged marriage. But for much of history, women did not have the power to choose or the power to decide whether they would or would not marry someone. Marriage as in fact, if I can back up, I can say this, that marriage happened for a number of reasons. One is for basic survival and reproduction. A family would get together and they would decide to have a union between their families that would allow one or the other to advance economically, or both of them to advance economically. And then that union, then they would also advance. And so through much of history, to farm the soil, to work the soil, especially during medieval times, the more children you had, the better. And so the way to do that was to bring them into the family unit, the man and the woman. And so you produced your own labor, especially if you were a peasant working for a vassal or a lord. You had to work the soil, and so you had to work the land. And so the more hands you had, the better it was for you economically. It also meant that you would have more leisure time if you had more hands to help you with that work. The other thing to consider is that children didn't live. It was not unusual for a significant number of the children born to a couple, or the children born to a woman, for many of those children to die in centuries, in millennia past. And so the whole idea of having multiple children, it ensured your bloodline, it helped you economically, it helped with your leisure time. There were a number of reasons why, in addition to the fact, remember, that if you were in the West, the church had prohibited any type of contraception and any type of abortion, at least at a certain point. We should, in fact, you know what? Scratch that, because I don't want you to think that the prohibition on abortion as we understand it today has always been the case. It has not, and I'm going to get into that in just a few minutes. But certainly, if you were, the church had a position that you should not have sex unless you intended to procreate. And so then having children was the primary reason of having sex. It's in the 17th, 18th century that couples began to marry for other reasons. As we would think, they began to elect their partners, their marriage partners, and love became a factor in the relationship. So that was not originally the case, and for most of history, love was not the case. Even some of the fabled stories of the past, like Antony and Cleopatra, that was not so much a love story as much as it was a union between the Roman Empire and the Egyptian Empire to hopefully secure some type of peace It was not about love. And through most of history, marriage on the whole was not about love. That's not to say that it never happened, but that's what made something like Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet so remarkable, because then you did have a story about love, and you did have that whole idea of can a couple love each other and be together even though their families might forbid their relationship. So for the Western world, however, the way I like to explain this, and this is beginning to get into the two parts of marriage that I was talking about last week. So the Roman Empire had spread throughout Europe for the most part, and at some point it just got too large for the Roman Empire to administer everything. And so each little village was at some point taking care of administrative tasks like this, like recording when a couple had decided to form a bond which would become a legal marriage. Now, at this point, there is no religious involvement in it. So during much of medieval time, the church is not involved in marriage at all. There's no religious involvement at all. But as the Roman Empire fell, those villages and towns still had the responsibility. And in each and every one of those towns, by the time the Roman Empire was falling, because Christianity had become the official religion of the Roman Empire in 313, so in each of those little towns, there was a church. And churches kept records. In fact, you can go to some churches that have existed for hundreds and, in some cases, nearly 2,000 years. I visited one this past May in Canterbury, St. Martin's Church. It has parts of that church date back to Roman times. So we're talking about the 2nd and 3rd century. Parts of that church have existed. And you could go throughout Europe and you can find the exact same thing, churches that have existed for close to 2,000 years. And so many of those churches, in some cases, have records spanning back hundreds of years, maybe even 1,000 years or more. And so knowing that churches kept these records, it became the norm, kind of the accepted thing, that churches would keep the records rather than the town. And so churches then would then act as the legal agent for the civil authorities to unite a couple in marriage. And so they would then pronounce that a couple was legally joined. And so as this began to happen more and more and more and more through the centuries, the church began to realize, the Western church began to realize, the Eastern church as well, but we're primarily talking about Western here, began to realize that they needed to have a rationale, a theology for what they were doing, to understand how to understand marriage. And so they began then to look through scriptures, the Christian Bible, in some cases the Jewish Bible, to try to understand what they were doing when they were legally uniting people in marriage. And so by the year 1547, at the Council of Trent, the church declared that marriage was a sacrament. So if you were raised Roman Catholic and you know that there are 7 sacraments, prior to 1547, there were 6 sacraments. The 7th sacrament was married. It was the last one added. And that was because the church had to come up with a rationale for what marriage was, and what marriage meant to them theologically. And so it's at that point that a lot of prohibitions and a lot of the norms that we understand are then affixed to the institution of marriage. Incidentally, some other things, the white wedding dress. I know that this is not really has to do with ethics, but you know in class I would often throw things like this out. So the white wedding dress, Queen Victoria is the one who kind of set the standard on that. All the English women knew about her fantastic dress, and so they thought that they should have an equally wonderful white wedding dress as well. White fabric was certainly something most people could not afford, because you didn't want white fabric, because it could not stay clean. And so more than showing purity, white fabric for a bride actually was a symbol of status and wealth. The wedding cake with multiple tiers, you've probably been to a wedding or you've seen photos or things like that. That actually comes from St. Bride's Church in London. St. Bridget's Church, as it's also called, St. Bridget, St. Bride. St. Bridget is the patron saint of brides. And so at St. Bride's Church in London, on top of the church, there is a multi-tier steeple. And so the father of the bride thought that he would commemorate his daughter's wedding, the occasion of her wedding, by having a cake that was fashioned to look like the steeple of the church, so that people would know that she had been married there, and just as a thing, and he had money. And so that's where some of that multi-tier to the wedding cake. So a lot of the things that we think about wedding, we don't know how they came about. So that's at least two things. But one thing that I want to point out is, now remember that, marriage was originally a civil arrangement. It was not a theological church arrangement. So how did we get to the point where you can go to a member of the clergy, whether it be a rabbi, an imam, a priest, a pastor, a Buddhist monk in some instances? Why did it come that you can go to them to be married? Well, it dates back to those medieval times when the churches took over that function, and they were acting then as agents of the state. So really, there are two parts to marriage as we understand it. This becomes important with our discussion when we talk about same-sex marriage or any other type of marriage. It is not really an issue of whether or not the church can endorse it. So it dates back to those medieval times where the church then began to act as an agent of the state. That's why if you want to be married, you can simply go to the justice of the peace or the county clerk. In fact, the license that is issued to a couple when they go and ask for a license to be married, as long as they appear before the county clerk and they sign the appropriate forms, in some sense, they can be married right then and there. They're legally joined as long as there are witnesses who join. In fact, in some states, a couple can perform the wedding ceremony for themselves and by themselves. Pennsylvania and Colorado. Pennsylvania, it came about because of their Quaker past. I don't know why it is that way in Colorado, unless it had to do with, at one point it was a frontier territory. But nevertheless, in at least two states, a couple can perform. I know a couple who they lived in Pennsylvania. They performed their own wedding. Basically, they decided that they were going to be married. They made vows with each other, and that's how they were married. They got the license, they signed it, sent it back to the county clerk. So it's important to remember that then what happens in the church or the synagogue or the mosque is not the wedding. That is more appropriately understood as the blessing of the marriage. So you are legally, civilly married, and then when you want a blessing for that, you go to your religious establishment, whether church, synagogue, imam, temple, whatever it is, then you go and you receive a blessing. And the priest or imam or rabbi acts then as an agent of the state, and they are deputized in some sense. The license then is for them to say, okay, you've appeared before the court, you've presented them all the legal documents that they need, So I'm simply going to say that you are making these legal promises to each other, and I'm going to act as an agent of the state. That dates back to medieval times. In my opinion, personally, this is one of the only things I'll tell you my opinion about until the end of the semester. But hey, you know what? You don't get to ask me those questions. I always let the class ask me about anything, and I give my opinion. But in my opinion, I'll tell you on this, I think that all couples, I think that all marriage should be completely detached from the religious aspects of it. And when you want to be married, and this is the way it is in a lot of European countries, when a couple wants to be married, they go to their civil authority, whether that's the county courthouse or town hall, whatever it is, and there they take, they sign the legal documents and they become legally married. Then, if they want the blessing of a religious ceremony or religious authority, then they will go to the church or the synagogue or the mosque. I also think that it is perfectly valid to do it the other way around, that a couple can decide they don't want state involvement, they don't want the legal aspects of their marriage, they simply want it done for spiritual reasons, and in that case, they can go to the imam, the rabbi, the priest, the pastor, and have their union blessed, and not necessarily have to worry about whether or not there is a legal document. In some cases, common law then, after a certain time, would attach, especially in states and countries where English law has been part of it. So common law then would take hold of that relationship. But people should have the option. Couples should have the option of doing it both ways. Well, there's some other aspects about this that I want to bring to your attention. So in the 1940s, 50s, there was two studies, 40s, 50s, 60s, a couple of studies that came out. One was by Alfred Kinsey. There was a movie made about this. Liam Neeson played Alfred Kinsey in the movie, I think it was, and it was called the Kinsey Report, and it was something like sexual behavior in the American male, or something like that, in the 40s. In the 1950s, another one came out, something like sexual behavior in the American female. Don't quote me on the titles, but it is Alfred Kinsey who put out those, and he looked at the fact that the majority of men, and it come to find out, many of the women were not virgin at the time that they were married, that they had engaged in other types of sex as well, and so not just the typical male-female type of sex, that many cases they had experimented with other types of sex and done other things. And this was somewhat shocking to people at that time, at least those people who were willing to read those reports. One person who picked up on those and became intrigued by those was Hugh Hefner, as in Hugh Hefner of Playboy. And that was what kind of spurred him on to create Playboy, part of what spurred him on to make Playboy magazine. Now, you'll have to forgive me, my dissertation dealt with Playboy, so I could really talk for a long time about that, but I'm not going to do that. I will mention a couple of other things about Playboy in just a moment. But the other report, in addition to the Kinsey report, his two reports, was a report by Masters and Johnson. This couple also began to look at the sexual behavior for American couples and published a report as well. Well, all of this kind of entered into the mainstream of American culture in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s. And so by the time, and here I will reference Playboy, by the time Playboy came along in the 1950s and really entered into its own in the 1960s, because of these reports and because of magazines like Playboy and eventually others that were published as well, but Playboy being more the highbrow of those magazines. In fact, the court ruled in a particular case that Playboy was not pornography. The same could not be said about magazines like Penthouse and Hustler, but Playboy was determined not to be pornography by the Supreme Court. However, because of the Kinsey report, Masters and Johnson and Playboy magazine and the feminist movement, America then began to experience a sexual revolution. And so by the 1960s, especially the late 60s, not in the early 60s, but by the late 60s, the United States is experiencing a full-blown sexual revolution. And so one of the things that I like to point out is that Hugh Hefner in his magazine was very much for the sexual revolution and the sexual liberation of women. And he was one of the early financial contributors and supporters of women's liberation and the ERA and things like that. And the reason he was is because for him and his understanding, it did no good for men to be sexually liberated if they did also not have willing partners. Does that make sense? So you can have men who say, all right, I can have sex all I want to, but that does them no good if they also don't have sexual partners then. And so Hefner began to contribute and support the sexual revolution and women's liberation in that sense because he thought that men needed partners. And so the sexual revolution by the late 60s, going into the 70s, was full-blown in the United States. Well, another thing happened in the late 1960s as well, 1969, I believe it was homosexuality began to, how do I want to say it? It began to be noticed more. Homosexuality has been around for thousands of years. It is not a modern thing. There are stories told in ancient Greece that are written down about how that there are accounts of men brushing other men's hair and having relationships with them, having sex with them. It was considered perfectly normal, especially for wealthier men, to have young men and to have sexual relationships with them equally as they would with women. So homosexuality has long been known in the ancient world and throughout time. It's only during medieval times that it began to have a negative connotation. In fact, the word homosexual did not enter the English lexicon until the 1800s. I believe it's mid to late 1800s was when the term was coined and came into the English lexicon. So it was not a pejorative even then when it was simply used to describe a sexual act between two people of the same sex, homosexual. In fact, if you break down the etymology of the word, you'll find it just means human sex. But anyway, but it came to have pejorative terms later thereafter. But the Stonewall riots in 1969 really brought same-sex relationships and same sex to the forefront of the American consciousness. And if you don't know about the Stonewall riots, I'd encourage you to look it up. It happened in New York, down in the Village in New York. And so really, though, even though there was this undercurrent, let me just add that Hugh Hefner also was an early proponent of homosexuality as well, and supported that, and had interviews and conversations about homosexuality in his magazine. But homosexuality then remained kind of an undercurrent in American culture until the 90s. And really in the 90s, it began to come into its own. You had Ellen, who announced on national television. She had a television program, a comedy program called Ellen, before she had a talk show, and she announced over a loudspeaker as part of a comedy gag that she was gay. You have things like Will and Grace that kind of mainstreamed the idea. These mainstreamed the idea of same-sex relationships, homosexuality, and so they became things that people could talk about. And of course, we know that in 2014, I think it was, if I have my dates correct, that the Supreme Court ruled that there should be no prohibition on same-sex marriage. And they base that, going back now to what I was telling you a moment ago about the distinction between civil marriage and religious marriage. So what the Supreme Court ruled is that there was no reason why civil authorities, your town council, your town hall, your county seat, there was no reason why the county clerk or the town clerk could not issue a marriage for two people of the same sex, looking at it strictly from a civil point of view. The Supreme Court did not say, on the other hand, literally here I'm talking on the other hand, that religious institutions had to then step in and bless those civil relationships. And so in same-sex marriage, you can really see the dichotomy of those two aspects to legal marriage, the civil side and the religious side. So the civil side of marriage for same-sex is perfectly legal, whereas the Supreme Court did not say in any instance that religious authorities had to endorse it. Now, we do know that there are religious authorities who do. The Methodist churches right now are in a heated battle. In fact, it looks like, it's decided that the Methodist Church will split, United Methodist Church will split between those who will endorse same-sex marriage and those who will not. The Episcopal Church went through the same sort of thing. The Episcopal Church in the U.S. Went through the same sort of thing, and most Episcopal churches now do provide for same-sex marriage. The Lutherans have largely embraced it, the UCCs, and there are some others who have embraced it. Of course, you have the Roman Catholic Church that is not embraced blessing of same-sex relationships. Well, now let's fast forward even more. And around 2010, so in the 2000 teens, another revolution began to happen. So first you have the sexual revolution, then you have the same-sex revolution, and then in the 2000 teens, you began to have the gender revolution. And so it's important here, one distinction, I won't go into a lot of discussion about gender identity. I gave you at least two videos that help you understand that, but there's an important distinction to remember here. Gender is a construct. Sex, as in the biological determination, in most cases is not a construct. So whether you are born anatomically male or female is usually an absolute. The exception being what is sometimes called the middle sex. It used to be referred to as hermaphrodites, and in cases in years past, a determination would be made for a child before they ever realized. So they were born with genitals for both male and female, and so in the days before genetic testing, a determination would be made. Okay, this is going to be a boy, or this is going to be a girl. And that happened to a staggering number of people. Nowadays, that is not the case. Usually, if there's a genetic test, then they will decide if it's, if the child is male or female, or in some cases, they'll make no determination, and the child will be able to make that determination later. There is, it's now, again, there was a book published a few years ago called The Middle Sex, and it is about people who are born with both genitals. So when we're talking about gender, we're not talking about that, okay? That is not what we're talking about. We're in that we're talking about male, female, or middle sex. Gender, what we're talking about, is more like the terms of masculine, feminine. And so you can be genetically, and your genitalia can be that of a male. So biologically, you are male, but you can be very effeminate. You might even identify with female characteristics, and vice versa could be the same. You could be genetically and in every way a female biologically, but you might identify with more masculine characteristics. And so gender then is a construct. And so it's important to make that distinction between biological or biology and the constructs of gender. Then you have a further movement of trying to then identify someone's sexuality. Nowadays, we understand that just as gender can be fluid, or gender can be a construct that you embrace or don't embrace one or the other, or you embrace multiples, there's also nowadays, as we understand it, multiple sexualities. And those span the whole spectrum, not just hetero and homosexual, but it can be asexual. There are people who just they don't engage in sex, all the way to people who are rather pansexual, and they might have a very strong libido, and they would engage in sex with multiple types of partners. So when we're dealing with this issue, and we're looking at sexuality and the issues of sexuality from an ethical point of view, it can be quite difficult then, because we have to define some things. We have to define gender. We have to define what type sex someone is engaging in. And so last week, I presented you with a quote, and I'll share this with you again, just so that you can remember it. That the sexual act cannot be immoral because it is sex, but it can be immoral if it violates moral principles and rules, such as autonomy, beneficence, and so forth. So the sexual act cannot be immoral because it is sex. So just having sex is not immoral in and of itself. It is a biological function. But sex becomes immoral if it violates moral principles. And so if you have an unwilling partner, and so then you have rape, there are other ways. If someone doesn't consent to, for example, bondage or something like that, then it becomes an immoral act, and abusive, and a violation of moral principles. Before we go on, and there's so much that if we were actually in class, I would love to bring to your attention, or to ask questions about, and to really look at. We could talk more about the Me Too movement. We really haven't touched on that. We could talk about prostitution, whether or not it should be legal. At what point should sexual consent be, should someone be allowed to give sexual consent? There are states where it has been as low as 12 and 13. Other states it's 16. Other states it's 18. And so there are good arguments for all of those, certainly. And what about if the age of consent, majority age, is 16, and a guy or a girl has a boyfriend or girlfriend who is 18. In a situation like that, technically, if the girl, let's just use a kind of typical example. If the girl were almost 16 but not 16, so she's still technically 15, and her boyfriend was 18, and they engaged in sex in a state where the age of consent is 16, then the guy could be charged with a sexual crime, and then would have to register as a sex offender and potentially have that hanging over his head for many years to come. And then, of course, you can imagine all the difficulty that would come with that. So there's a lot of things to think about there, and I asked some of those questions in the essays that I put up for you, and I'll put up some more probably this week in the next day or two. But there's four questions that I would highlight that goes into consideration for moral sex. So 4 questions. And so these I would just offer to you. You won't be quizzed on these in any way, but I offer these to you as a moral way of thinking about sex. Number 1, what do I want sex to mean? What is the meaning of sex for you? What do I want sex to mean? Number 2, does my partner understand, or does my partner's understanding of sex match mine? So the person with whom you're going to engage in sex, does their understanding of sex match yours? So if you're having sex and your understanding is, you know what, this is, I'm mating for life. But your partner says, nah, I'm in it for a good time. Then it probably wouldn't be a good match for you to have sex with. The third question, does the self show self-respect? Does the sex show self-respect and respect for my partner? I'll repeat that. Does the sex show self-respect, so respect for yourself, and respect for my partner? And the fourth question, am I choosing to have sex, or is my judgment coerced or influenced? So am I choosing to have sex, or is my judgment coerced or influenced? Now, those questions really, I think, take on a new meaning in light of the Me Too movement. And then, of course, it's a reality that we have to ask, what about when someone is under the influence of drugs and alcohol? What if they are ordinarily consenting partners? If one of the partners is sober, oh no, forget that. If they're both drunk and they're ordinarily consenting partners, is sex just understood between those two? Those are definitely moral and ethical questions that we have to think about carefully and deeply. So I'll go over those 4 questions again. What do I want sex to mean? Does my partner's understanding of sex match mine? Does the sex show self-respect and respect for my partner? Am I choosing to have sex, or is my judgment coerced or influenced? So those are some questions to consider when you're thinking about the issue of sex. Now, we could really break it down, and we could think of about sex in terms of utility. We could think of sex in terms of Kantianism. We could talk about sex in terms of natural law. Not really going into all of that right now, because in the last few minutes, I want to shift gears quickly and go over a little bit about abortion. So when we talk about abortion, we're talking about terminating a pregnancy. Now, the language with which you talk about that is indicative of is often indicative of how you view it. So, if you talk of it in terms of a child, when you terminate a pregnancy, you're killing a child. I would assume in that instance that you're probably against abortion. But if you speak of the fetus, then I would probably presume that for you, abortion is not so much of an issue. And so I want to quickly go over a brief history of abortion because so often nowadays we just hear about Roe v. Wade, and we talk about abortion as somehow beginning in 1973, January 22nd, 1973. But there is thousands of years of history, and I'm not going to, by any stretch, go into all of that, but I do want to highlight for you just a little bit of the history of abortion. I'm getting it here in my notes. So, going back more than 3,000 years ago, 3,000 BC, so that's more than 5,000 years ago, the Royal Archives of China hold the earliest written record of an abortion technique. So 5,000 years ago in China, there are written records of techniques for abortion. And that continues even through Egyptian times. We know that in medical texts, there are, in Egyptian medical texts, there are recipes for spermicide that is made from plants, lint, and honey. There's also in ancient Egypt, almost 4,000 years ago, there is a contraception that was made from various chemicals, including crocodile dung. So as much as 4,000 years ago, the Egyptians had a method for abortion and for contraception that included crocodile dung, lint, and honey. And so through the Roman Empire, we know that, for example, Plato spoke of devices that would prevent pregnancy, so that we see it in the early church in the 200s. So in the 3rd century, the ancient Christian theologian Tertullian, he wrote about a method for abortion. Yes, this is an early Christian theologian, Tertullian. He wrote of a method of abortion that, quote, involved a copper needle or spike and a blade and hook device. So as early as the 3rd century, Christians were talking about abortion, and we know that early Christians were aware of it. Augustine condemned abortion, but by no means did that become the widespread understanding of Christians at that point. If we fast forward to the 1100s in the Muslim Empire, here I'm talking about specifically in Iran, and I believe it was a caliphate during that time, and there was an Iranian physician who wrote, "When the male does come apart from her, he should order her to have a good shake 7 times. When they get up, he should again try to make her expel the semen. For this, he should cause her to sneeze. So sneezing was a method of contraception in the 12th century. Thomas Aquinas also opposed to abortion because he was a natural theologian. So in natural philosophy and natural theology, you would not do anything to interfere, remember, with what is natural. And so he was largely against abortion, except for the 30-day period before the fetus was, quote, ensouled. So as long as the fetus, the pregnancy was terminated within 30 days of contraception, it was fine, but he believed after 30 days, the fetus then would have a soul. So that's when it would become ensouled. In the 1540s, when the Church of England broke with the Roman Catholic Church in 1540, abortion was no longer considered a crime under the common law. So in the 1540s, in England, abortion was not a crime. Fast forward to the 1700s. We know that condoms were sold in pubs and barbershops, in what we would know today as pharmacies throughout Europe and Russia, and also into the Americas. In the 1700s, there was also the largest distributor of condoms was a factory owned by Mrs. Perkins and Mrs. Phillips in England. In the 1750s, there was a reference to condoms. Also Casanova in France. In the 1800s, John Stuart Mill, a British philosopher, wrote that contraception was no more unnatural than putting up an umbrella against the rain. So in the 1800s, it was commonly understood that contraception was okay to be used, just like you would use an umbrella. He, however, preferred the withdrawal method. If you're not sure what that is, you need to look it up. So he preferred the withdrawal method as, quote, all other methods that have been devised are apt to be highly offensive to the delicacy of women. So other means of contraception he thought would offend the woman. That included use of condoms. In 1821, Connecticut passed the first law restricting abortion in the United States. You'll remember that Connecticut was founded as a Congregationalist colony. And so those were still, in fact, I think the church was still established in Connecticut as late as the 1820s. And so 1821, Connecticut passed a law. It became a criminal act to give a woman who was quick with child a poison to induce a miscarriage. In 1869 is when the Roman Catholic Church officially condemned the practice of abortion at all stages of pregnancy. Before then, the church had felt that abortion before ensoulment of the fetus, this goes back to Aquinas, was perfectly fine, and that was within 30 days of conception. In 1873, we have the Comstock Law, which criminalized contraception and abortion in the United States, except when a physician deemed it necessary. It was 1873. So up until then, in the United States, it was still legal. In the early 1800s, the word abortion wasn't commonly used. Instead, women used euphemisms such as bringing their courses on, that is, their period, having it done, and getting fixed up or getting straight. So abortion was not really talked about. Also in the early 1900s, abortion was illegal. But women used knitting needles, crochet hooks, hairpins, scissors, and button hooks. Those were used to to lace their shoes to induce miscarriages and terminate pregnancies, but that would often cause severe injury or death to women, and could also, the injury could prevent further pregnancy. In 1912, the U.S. Post Office um, tried to stop the sale of contraception by mail. Um, by the 1920s, Planned Parenthood had created a calendar to help women devise or determine when they were having ovulation so as to prevent pregnancy. In the 1930s, the United States was seeing almost 700,000 abortions each year, even though they were technically illegal. During the 1930s, also, the Great Depression, contraceptions became quite common and were socially acceptable because people could not afford to have children during the Great Depression. In the 1930s, abortion increased until many physicians began to specialize in abortion, although they had to do it kind of in a clandestine sort of way. In the 1950s, Alfred Kinsey, who I mentioned at the beginning of this lecture, remarked, "There is more difficulty in locating abortionists today than there used to be. The laws have made it more difficult to find a physician who will perform it, and that has raised the cost of abortion." So that's in the 1950s. In 1965, the pill came on the market, and this revolutionized. This is part of what contributed to the sexual revolution, and that's when women then began to more freely have sex because they had control over whether or not they would become pregnant. And so again, it's in 1973 that the Supreme Court overturned abortion bans. Bear in mind, the court did not make abortion legal. It simply said that states could not ban abortion under certain circumstances. And of course, if you follow the news, you know that in recent years there have been multiple attempts to overturn Roe v. Wade and reverse it to make abortion more difficult. In fact, during the current pandemic that's going on in the country, there are a couple of states that have put at least a temporary moratorium on abortion because they feel that the facilities and the equipment that would be used for elective abortion should be used right now for wider protection in medicine because of the pandemic. Now, quickly, I want to wrap this up. There are some reasons why a woman might have an abortion, or a couple might decide together to have an abortion. And I can tell you, this first one, when I worked in a hospital, I did see this on a few occasions. So there are birth defects to the fetus that would make it unviable. The child would not be viable. And so for certain birth defects, abortion would be the preferable course of treatment. I'll just tell you, in one occasion, I saw a child that had been delivered through an abortion, and it had no facial features except a mouth. So it had no eyes, no ears, did not have a nose, and it had a mouth that had 4 lips. So if you can imagine 4 folds of skin, and that was the mouth that had developed. sorry, but it was quite grotesque. And so you can understand why a pregnancy like that should not be brought to term, because the child would not survive, and it would only cause more difficulty to carry that child, more difficulty for the mother to carry that child, and then and deliver it, only to be delivering a dead child. So birth defects are one reason why someone might have an abortion. Rape. Would it be ethical to require a woman to carry her rapist's baby to term? Incest, similar question. A father abuses a daughter. Would it be right to force that daughter then to carry her brother to term? There are issues where the life of the mother is jeopardized. And so the child, if it's a choice between giving birth and the mother dying, or aborting the child and the mother living, in some instances, it is preferable then to abort the child. Sometimes the fetus is not viable in and of itself, and so it could have some other deformity that for which it needs to be terminated. And then you could ask the question, then if you are going to allow abortion for reasons like that, what about for sex selection? Let's just say I've got 3 daughters already. I don't want another daughter. I want a son. Is that a reason then to terminate a pregnancy? Generally speaking, most people would say no. But if it's before the 3rd trimester, or even the 2nd trimester, what would ethically be the problem there if you object to that? What would be the issue there to take into consideration when you're talking about sex selection? What about the father? When we're talking about ethical issues, does the father have a right, have a say in whether or not an abortion happens? What about if we're going to prohibit abortion, especially under certain circumstances? What about women who engage in risky behavior? If a woman drinks, if a woman takes drugs, especially drugs that are not prescribed, should that woman then be charged with endangering her child or endangering the fetus? Is there an ethical dilemma there? Is there an ethical problem there to take into consideration? We've talked before about a child being born. I think it's sometimes called a savior baby. Should then, what about if you needed certain parts or certain material to aid the child that you already have? Perhaps they have a rare blood type, and the only way to cure them is to have a genetic match child. Would that then be acceptable to bring a child into the world, or at least to conceive the child, just to harvest whatever is needed? There are so many other questions when we talk about this abortion debate. We don't have time to get into all of them, but I hope that this has been something that you're able to think about. And in the next day, I will put up maybe another discussion question, and I'll also put a quiz up next week. You have a quiz for last week that I just published today, and so by next Monday or Tuesday, I'll put up a quiz for you to take to show that you have continued to read the material that was assigned and that you've viewed this lecture. Okay, guys, stay healthy, stay safe, stay at home as much as you possibly can. And I'll see you next week. You've got my email address, so email me if you have any questions. Have a good day.